See all of you here. We have some really exciting news for the basin to share today. The Costilla County Conservancy District, along with the Rio Grande Restoration Program and Tailwater, put together a grant application this spring and obtained funding to hire a watershed coordinator. So, a watershed coordinator is coming to the basin soon. Hopefully by July you'll have a face here that can help organize, coordinate, and move projects forward within the basin. I'm really excited about this funding and how we were able to obtain it. Let's see here. The WSRF funds, Water Supply Reserve funds, were applied for through the Rio Grande Basin Roundtable. And as we were looking for this funding, we needed to find match. And the Conservancy District was able to find $55,000. And as part of this project, we were reaching out to landowners to get letters of support. And we reached out to William with Cielo Vista and described the assessment to him and described what we were planning to do. And at the end of the conversation, he asked, how much do you need? What kind of match do you need? He said, I'll provide this remaining $70,000 of match to make this project move forward. And so I'm really excited to share with you that not only was grant funding secured, but we were also able to secure the entire match and be able to leverage that to bring a watershed coordinator and a few other elements to the basin, which I'll discuss later. So I'm here today to discuss the last pieces of the Upper Culebra Watershed Assessment. After beginning this project way back in 2018 with stakeholder engagement in the Conservancy District, bringing people together to eventually hire contractors, including myself, to complete the watershed assessment. We were on the ground in 2021, finished the rangeland assessment in 2022, and I am proud to present to you a paper copy of the Upper Culebra Watershed Assessment. One of the amazing things about this assessment is, unlike the stream management plans that were completed for the Conejos, the Rio Grande, and the Swatch, this assessment covers more topics and is more comprehensive. It doesn't cover just the streams, it covers rangeland management, safety and emergency management, post-fire debris flows, all of those things that affect the community. And so some of the highlights of this assessment are all of the 12 tasks and looking at all of the diversion records. We looked at all of the diversion structures. There's information about every one of the acequias in that report in multiple places depending on the topic. There's information about wildlife and recommendations. There are priority projects. We had 25 different priority projects and or project areas because sometimes it was really difficult to say, oh, well, let's put this ditch first. Said, hey, we need fish passage at the diversion structures, and left it more open. So when you go to the RCPP funding or one of those, then you can say, hey, my acequia needs fish passage. Yes, every acequia needs fish passage. We all need sediment management. We all need reduced erosion. All of the acequias need to work with the environment. They need to support natural resources because that's what we're depending on to provide the livelihood of the basin. So as we develop the priority projects, we go back to this list of very general goals. And number one, community safety. Because if we can improve the safety of the people, then we're not trying to deal with disaster after it strikes. We're able to plan for it and be able to mitigate some of the hazards associated with flooding, fire, debris flow. And then talking with Stephen Romero and a lot of the other basin users, there's a lot of concern that, productivity is down. And how are we going to be sustainable into the future? Water, this whole assessment was based on water and rangelands. And how do we work together? So, in this basin is very unique because of the sharing that occurs within the basin. How do we support bringing in some of these practices while supporting the culture that is so rich in the community? Traditions are important. We need to work together to incorporate traditions and use those traditions where they work, and they've been shown to work. Wildlife, support the wildlife, support those animals that make living here home. Farming, of course, that's the livelihood and the economy. That's what supports and enables us to make money and thrive in today's community. And so really, rather than focusing on this assessment, what I really want to focus on is what's next. So we have a report, it's in paper. But what does that really mean? And really, this is just the first steps in moving forward to building those partnerships and collaborating to improve the conditions within the basin. This whole process is about the community working together, trying things, finding out what works and what doesn't work, and then evaluating and adapting and change. And those are the key principles of adaptive management. Sometimes you have to try things to find out they don't work, and sometimes you try things and they work really well. Regan talking about trying to drag the fence across, it's only 150 feet. Oh, well, if I spend a little bit of time winding up the wire, I can be a heck of a lot more efficient. Now, it's those little losses, it's sharing with your neighbors, not only the successes, but the failures. When do you learn the most? It's not when everything goes perfect, right? It's when you have to dig yourself out of the hole. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, funding has been obtained to hire a watershed coordinator and fund this position for 3 years, or is it 4 years? I think it's 3 years. And so that gives it a lot of time to develop the programs, do the stakeholder engagement. One of the key pieces of this basin is the shared natural resources, and that includes grazing, easements, and firewood and timber gathering easements on Cielo Vista Ranch. And so these shared resources require people to work together to use those resources. And one of the places we were trying to figure out is, how do we start moving towards management of these lands so that we can see those increased yields, so the stocking rates can be improved. The rangeland assessment found that generally we don't have a lot of bare ground in the meadows on Cielo Vista, which is really good. You're not trying to start from scratch. But we don't have a lot of connectivity. The meadows are generally hammered, and it would benefit a lot from even just a little bit of change in management. And so working together, when everybody's trying to share these meadows, we're going to have some common ground. And so we developed this idea of a demonstration watershed. And this is demonstrating a lot of the concepts that are proposed in the assessment, NRCS, and a lot of different folks. Is developing a forest management plan. So the Congreso Creek watershed was selected because it's one of the smaller watersheds. And so keeping things manageable, saying, hey, this is gonna be a good one. And then we would also use Torcito Creek as kind of our paired watershed. So we're gonna look at what happens when you manage one, and then look at what's happening on the other without management. And so through this, you're gonna see a lot of stakeholder engagement. You're gonna be reached out by the watershed coordinator and bring people together to identify what the best strategy to start with for rangeland management would be. And then also with this is forest management. You know, in the past, the clear-cut logging and all of those things caused significant sediments to come down from the mountain. But lack of fire, lack of logging has caused the forests to be overgrown and susceptible to insects and diseases. If we've watched anything with the fires across the state and across the western US, fires are growing hotter, they're bigger, and they're leaving devastating scars in their path. And so action is needed to help make the forest healthier so it can resist wildfire, so that if there is a fire, or more appropriately, when there's a wildfire, the fire burns cooler and doesn't spread as quickly. That helps the ground, the soils, not be sterilized, keeps those seed banks in place so that the next growing season they naturally recover. And the third piece of the Congreso Creek watershed is looking at what happens when you reconnect your floodplains. So the irrigated meadow at the bottom is one of those areas that was incised. And so when I talk about incision, I mean that the stream bed has decreased. And so the water level available to the adjacent lands has also been decreased. And what happens with that is that your irrigation efficiency declines, because when you irrigate, you now must fill a greater portion of that water column to keep water at the roots of your crop. So if we're able to bring the stream back up and reconnect that floodplain, we can see increases in water use efficiency along with increases in crop output. And so here's just some pictures from the assessment. Some of the meadows you see, the short grasses that have been overgrazed. Here's the Congreso Creek where it's been disconnected. You see where the text is that terrace. And so that's where the stream used to be connected. And there were some beaver dams that failed, and ultimately the stream moved down. And you see all the grasses next to the stream are in really good condition. They've got a lot of water. They don't need to be irrigated. And this field happens to be very well irrigated. Danny Quintana spends a lot of time moving water around and is very meticulous about his operation. But he has to put a lot more work into that field to be able to get the yields that he does. And then we've got the ditches along the sides where they run. They've also incised. And so when we do that, we have fine sediments eroding. And the fine sediments, not only do they impact the diversion structures, but they also end up in places like Sanchez Reservoir. And it's those sediments that were identified as the #1 input for mercury within Sanchez Reservoir. And so that's where the TMDL for mercury and the signs you all see about mercury in the fish, one of the ways to help mitigate that is to reduce fine sediment inputs into Sanchez Reservoir and your other water bodies. As Patrick and Kathy alluded to this morning, we were talking about nutrients. Those fine sediments also take the nutrients from your fields when they end up in the streams and down in the reservoir, they grow algae, and that's where we're getting toxic algal blooms. So actions that can be used to reduce those fine sediments not only keep the nutrients on your farm where your plants can use them, but they also improve the conditions for the downstream water users. So I have a request for you. And Daniel did a really good job of talking about the collaboration process that needs to go into these projects to make them successful. And so as these projects move forward and we're working towards moving things forward in the basin, I ask you to participate any way you can, whether it's joining a board, whether it's reading a social media post, any way you can. If somebody calls you up and says, hey, let's discuss something, give them the time of day to at least have a conversation. And if you've got ideas for projects on your lands that will benefit not only yourself, but also the rest of the community, we want to hear those too. Because the most efficient projects we can do are ones where there are willing landowners, where somebody says, hey, I want to work with you. I want to acknowledge all the people that did a lot of work on this assessment, and I've included contact information for the sub-consultants that helped us complete this project. I believe this will be posted online so you can get those contact information. If you have any questions about the assessment, about where we're moving forward, please feel free to reach out to me. Email me, call me. I will call you back. I ask you to ask questions because that's how we spread the information in this assessment and how we are able to utilize the information to improve the conditions within the basin. And then, do I have time? Sure. Okay. I also included the rangeland assessment at the end of this. It's the only task that we haven't covered at the Congreso yet. And so this is going to get a little more technical, but I thought I would share some of the things that were done and how we approach the rangeland assessment in a little less traditional manner. So the rangeland assessment was completed by Open Range Consulting using remotely sensed data. And so the reason we used remotely sensed data is because it enabled us in venue to go back in time. So we can use satellite data and historic aerial imagery to look at how the condition of the rangelands have changed. But the first piece of this assessment required delineation of the meadows where grazing actually occurs. And so we went through and have mapped all of the meadows and given them very generic names. And so you'll notice at the bottom of these slides, there are URLs. So these maps or versions of these maps are available online. You can move them around and zoom in. There's a little bit more information. So these are the meadows that we actually assessed for the rangeland assessment. And some of the practices we saw while out in the field looking at streams and lack of woody riparian vegetation, cows grazing, lots of green grass. So one of the things we looked at was percent bare ground. And like I mentioned earlier, that's generally pretty good in the basin. We at least have root cover that helps reduce erosion. And then they went through and used image recognition to identify the various types of vegetation classes. And so our most wet areas, so we're looking mostly at wet meadows, are going to be this woody riparian and that herbaceous. This really green areas, those areas that have a lot of water. And then looking at upland transitional conifer and aspen. Since we're looking at wet meadows, really you don't want to see a lot of transitional or upland vegetation. And so there are 4 years of aerial imagery available to be analyzed. And this is one of the meadows. And the acres of each classification was identified through image recognition. And so this is Salazar Meadow, and one of the notable things is that there is very limited herbaceous. And then we've got a little bit more transitional, and it varies year to year depending on the water and some of those things. But overall, we saw this general trend in most of the meadows. So that's suggesting we don't have very good connection with our streams, and that some actions are needed to bring that water table back up. And the other piece we looked at was this NVDI, or just think of it as how green is it? And generally we see a downward trend in greenness. So that would say, hey, things are degraded. And so the general recommendations are, hey, don't keep the cows on the meadows all the time. They need to be moved around. And if you can move the cattle and not graze them every year during the hottest part of the year, things will greatly improve. And so, are there any questions? Yes, John?
Is there a culture of fens in our study area? And have they been degraded like they have in the southern Sangre de Cristo?
Jacques' question was about fens. And there are some fens that are not as impacted, and I think actually more that they probably were impacted sooner is really the bigger piece of it.
But I mean, that looks like a typical degenerated area.
Yes.
Degraded area, I should say, that used to have a fen where there is now a stream.
So this is where a salt block was placed.
There you go.
And so there would have been a fen up here at the Alpine.
Yeah.
And
you know, of course, this in particular is private property where I'm looking is the Forest Service. And it's just a totally management issue. And how to, with respect to the Forest Service, maybe they didn't know, but they basically eliminated 30% of the water retention of the southern Sangre de Cristo.
yes. And we see similar practices. Probably, obviously things have changed. There's the litigation with access to Cielo Vista definitely changed how things occur. Any other questions?
What is a fen? F-E-N, what is it?
It's a type of wetland that is fairly acidic.
Yeah, it really...
Would you mind repeating the question, because people in the back can't figure it out?
So the question was, what is a fen? And I have to admit my background is not plants. So I actually do stream restoration, but I don't do the vegetation side of things.
It's
essentially, if you look at that one picture there, it's a pretty good representation. This may not be an exact area, but it used to be almost from the bottom of those conifer trees in the back of ground, and over to the conifer trees on this side that we're sitting in, where the picture is being taken, probably, or somewhere over there, that there was a mat that was very similar to tundra, that there was a lot of different low-lying plants, and I don't even know the name, I'm not a biologist either, but there were plants that matted themselves in there, and they would grow, and then when the snows would fall, they acted as a sponge, and they really retained a huge amount of water in the Rocky Mountains in general, and then they let it out really slowly, so it would just weep down, and that recharged the springs down below, and the springs and the aquifers, and it kept kind of things healthy, starting at a very high in the watershed. Well, what happened when we got into a cattle culture out here, and some people in the old days so they were sort of our first intensive grazers. But when we got into cattle and we just put up, I mean, literally, we run some cattle on some 20,000 acre pastures, right? So there's no management of the cattle. They just do what they want. And so what they do in the evening, they go get down to where it's cool, or when it dries out, they go down to where it's cool in those fens and they eat. And then pretty soon, all of a sudden, water's there. Oh, wow, cool, because they kind of opened the sponge, they cut a hole in the sponge. So now they go down there and water. And of course, then they start hanging out there, and the flies are there, and everything's there. And pretty soon, they've eaten and eroded the entire fen. And so now you have an eroded cut like that, that's just a very itinerant stream, and there's no water retention in there. And so in New Mexico, there's a big effort up in the Tailwater and Midnight Meadows and some other areas to build structures and to fence the cattle off of those areas and to try to regenerate those fens back to salvage the water retention abilities of these valleys. So that's kind of a synopsis of what the word fen is related to here. And it actually, I think it comes from the British, I think it's a British Isles kind of word. Bogs.
Are there any other questions? Thank you for letting me present today, and I really look forward to working with you all in the future.